Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Adams, and I would like to welcome you to the Social Emotional Learning Global Leadership Series. Some of you have been on with us from the Curricula conference that is taking place today, and others are joining this particular session. So a quick introduction, there are three partners that are sponsoring this Social Emotional Learning Global Leadership Series, and they are Curricula, and Curricula is a global alliance for social emotional learning and life skills, a new organization that is trying to make sure that we are advocating and creating networks for people to be able to ensure that our students and our adults have an opportunity to develop those skills. Salzburg Global Seminar is out of Salzburg, Austria, and it was formed in 1947. It is a not-for-profit, and it is coordinating discussions with different sectors to try to make the world a better place, and we certainly know that that needs to happen right now. Finally, Knowledge Hook Signature Leadership Series is part of Knowledge Hook, which is a Canadian educational digital math company. And they are supporting teachers from grades 3 to grade 10, and they are supporting thought leadership, and this is an example of this. Really excited to be able to introduce the topic of the discussion. We are going to be talking about measuring what you treasure, new priorities, and thrilled to be able to say that joining us today are participants from 8 Canadian provinces and 21 states and 33 countries. So we're thrilled to have really great global representation. That's what it's all about, is sharing our work together. Today, we will be very honored to have Andreas Schleicher doing a big presentation, and Emiliana Rodriguez serving as a respondent and sharing some of her thoughts and observations. It's my pleasure to introduce to you my colleague on Curricula Executive, Dominic Regester. He, in addition to being on the Curricula Executive, he is Program Director for Salzburg Global Seminar. Dominic, over to you. Really looking forward to this session.
Thanks, Jennifer. As Jennifer said, I work for a relatively small organization called Salzburg Global Seminar, based in Salzburg in Austria. And our core mission is to challenge current and future leaders to shape a better world. And we are lucky to have two major education leaders with us today. Andreas Schleicher is Director for Education and Skills and Special Advisor on Education Policy to the Secretary General at the OECD. Andreas supports the Secretary General's strategy to produce analysis and policy advice that advances economic growth and social progress. The work of his directorate includes the Programme for International Student Assessment, PISA, the OECD Survey of Adult Skills, PIAC, and the OECD Teaching and Learning International Survey, TALIS, as well as the development and analysis of benchmarks on the performance of education systems. Emiliana Rodriguez is co-founder and education director at Atentamente, a Mexican organization that creates and implements social and emotional learning programs for children and adults. Her main field of expertise is the intersection between contemplative science and SEL. She has designed educational programs and curriculums on SEL that have been implemented at a national level through the Ministry of Education in Mexico, and she's also developed and implemented programs on SEL in private and public institutions across Mexico. She's an international speaker and collaborates as a consultant with the Ministry of Education, the United Nations Development Programme, the National Institute of Education and Evaluation in Mexico, Research Schools Internationals, OECD, and is a member of the Curricula Steering Committee. The format for today is that Andreas is going to present for about 30 minutes, and Emiliana will then reply, reflecting on his presentation in the Mexican context, and we will then have a discussion and try and answer as many of your questions as possible in the time that remains. So please post questions for either Andreas or Emiliana in the chat box on Zoom. So without any further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Andreas Schleicher.
Thanks so much, Dominic. And if I can just get my screen. I think you need to stop sharing here. But then look at this screen, what happened in between. You know, think about the early 2000s. Technology came into this in 2006, you know, the year before the iPhone was invented. 2009, social media coming into play, robotics, cloud computing, and last but not least, artificial intelligence. And while we should still treasure literacy, the construct of literacy has fundamentally changed. Today, when you don't know the answer to a question, you know, you look it up on Google and you'll find 100,000 answers to your question, and nobody will tell you what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy is no longer about extracting, prefabricated knowledge. It's about constructing knowledge. A very different kind of skill set. So what it means is that we need to adjust our metrics. Basically, if we leave our metrics in place, we measure the past. We will not look at how well young people are prepared for the present and the future. And if you look at this chart, what is actually happening in the principal industrialized countries is that performance has remained virtually flat. If you would see a line like this on a brain scan, you could very worry. We've seen very little change. We're teaching young people more of the same stuff. But when you look at the ideas that are now relevant, we see very, very little of change. This is the number that worried me most when we did our last PISA assessment. Less than 1 in young people had the capacity to systematically distinguish between fact and opinion in complex settings. I admit that. And you can say, well, it's a little bit better than it was in 2000 when it was 7%. But again, we live in a totally different world. And that's just about literacy. Fortunately, some countries show that you can actually change the needle. It's not that, this is not something that we could be changing. You look to Singapore, moving from good to great. You look to Estonia, significantly advancing. You look to Portugal or Poland in Europe. They have been able to change the paradigms. At the bottom of the scale, countries like Peru or Albania, a good example, but even in difficult resource constraints, we can change things. Or Brazil, and Turkey, maybe they have not seen such dramatic improvements, but still they've got a lot more people in the system and still raise the outcomes. Or you think about Sweden, a country that used to be sort of the star performer, then it lost a lot of ground, but it was able to turn things around and then improve things again. So there are some countries where we do see change in a construct that is so vital for today. Let me add one more dimension to this that I also think is very, very important. Take one country from the middle here, like the Slovak Republic, for example. When you look at the learners from the most disadvantaged backgrounds and the 10% most privileged ones, you can see they span the world. You come from a poor background, you are performing like students in the Philippines. You come from a wealthy background in the Slovak Republic, you can measure your performance against those in the top performing systems. And again, that's something that we have become accepted. We often, blame it on the student, on the families. It's something that is not to do with the education effort. But again, comparisons show us, poverty need not be destiny. If you look at the 10% most disadvantaged students in Portugal, you can see they measure up to the average student in the Slovak Republic. If you look to the most disadvantaged students in the coastal areas of China, you can see they do as well on this construct of 21st century literacy than the wealthy students in the Slovak Republic. I think that's a very, very important point that, poverty need not be destiny. This is really about our work in education, not where students come from alone. Obviously, that's one of the factors that shapes us. Now our immediate reaction is always to add more time or more money. And there is indeed a lot of variability in the time that students spend learning. You can see here in the United Arab Emirates, students spend close to 60 hours learning per week. And in Finland, it's just a little bit more than half of that time. Huge variability in the volume of learning time. But when you look at productivity, you can see in a country like Finland, students learn a lot in very little time, whereas in the United Arab Emirates, they spend a lot of time and actually learn quite little. And that's a very important message. I'm saying this because some people say, well, you can't really add, social emotional skills or advanced kind of critical thinking skills because we need to teach the basic game. We need a lot of curriculum time for this. Well, actually, what these data show you, volume of learning time is not a great predictor for learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are always the product of the time that we spend and the quality of the learning processes. Very, very important point because it's not a zero-sum game. We shouldn't treat it as a zero-sum game. So you just saw, money and time are not great predictors for the performance of an education system. But I show you a variable that's actually an amazingly strong predictor. You know, one of the things that we looked at in the PISA 2018 assessment is the growth mindset of students. To what extent do they believe that, you know, their own effort, their own ideas, their dreams are what's driving their success, rather than, you know, talent or social background or things that they cannot change. And you can see actually, you know, look at, you know, number one in the OECD area, Estonia, in performance, they're also number one when it comes to the growth mindset. You look at Indonesia, on the other hand, you know, they struggle on both fronts. Of course, you know, that relationship here is just a correlation. And it's not, you know, there's lots of exceptions from this. But isn't that pattern interesting? Mindset that we find among students actually highly more predictive on the success of an education system than, you know, the money that we spend or the time that we spend. And again, you know, we should treat the mindset not as something that is, you know, extraneous to the learning process. It's an integral part of the learning process. And if we do not measure it, we're unlikely to treasure it. We're always treating it as something nice to have rather than as one of the essentials. And let me show you this. You know, growth mindset wasn't just related to performance. We could also see a strong relationship with students' propensity to master difficult tasks, to have a greater sense of self-efficacy, to show less fear of failure. Now think about this. You know, if you want young people to be creative, which everybody talks about these days, they need to, you know, experience, they need to experiment, they need to try out things. If they try out things, they need to be able and willing to take risks. If they take risks, they're going to make mistakes. If they're afraid of mistakes, probably they're not going to be highly imaginative, creative. So you can see growth mindset actually shaping many of the outcomes that we value. Learning goals. Students with a growth mindset, they're more likely to see intrinsic value in schooling. You know, imagine in this Corona crisis, you know, you can have the best teacher, the best school. If you do not see value in schooling and you're suddenly thrown out of school, you need to learn on your own. Why would you invest your time and energy in this? So you can suddenly see that those variables that are often the blind spot of measurement, they actually could be very powerful variables to actually help us understand education performance. We also see, you know, I was just showing a slide on social inequality. One of the biggest struggles that we have in education, ensuring that every learner benefits from excellent opportunities. And you can see, for example, often girls are disadvantaged. Well, surprise, surprise, growth mindset is actually a bigger predictor for the success of girls than for boys. It's a better predictor for the success of disadvantaged students. Coming from a poor background, having that kind of growth mindset is going to help you to become more resilient. So those things are really, really important. We also see that young people with a growth mindset were more likely to aim higher in their lives when it comes to education. And this is actually something that is very consistent across countries. Some people say, well, you know, that's all a feature of student characteristics, you know, family background, social background, family wealth, and so on. But even when you sort of account for all of this, in the majority of countries, you can still see an impact. So, you know, we should take those things really serious. Last point I want to make on this is whether students are happy with their lives. An important question that people ask in this COVID context in particular. And you can see there are some high-performing education systems, you know, the Korea, Hong Kong, the far regions in China that we measured, where students do really well on academic tests, but they do not express a strong, you know, happiness with their life. And some people look at this and say, well, you know, we got to make a trade-off. You know, if we want young people to do well in school, we've got to put a lot of pressure on them, high expectations. And then, yeah, of course, you know, they're not going to enjoy life very much. But, you know, again, you can see other countries that do very well, like the Netherlands, like Finland, like Switzerland, like Estonia, where students actually express quite some, you know, happiness with life. So maybe we should include happiness as well in our kind of basket of measures or some broader aspects of well-being. And again, you know, some people say, well, you know, happiness is not about schooling, it's about, you know, friends and so on. But look at this. You can see actually the school climate is an important predictor for students' life satisfaction. Experiencing bullying, you know, strong negative predictor. The sense of belonging. School is a place, you know, where I feel I belong, where I make friends, where I sort of feel a sense of purpose. It's not just, you know, good for academic learning. It's also something that is actually strongly correlated with students' life satisfaction. the support from teachers, the feedback that teachers give, the sense of cooperation. All of those things actually seem to be related, not just to the academic world, but also to the extent that students are happy with their lives. So once again, we shouldn't miss out on those when we measure the success of an education system. So we have at the OECD tried to work at this more systematically. And we've designed this idea of a learning compass, as we call it. Why a learning compass? Because in the world of tomorrow, learning is not just about learning something. The most important attribute is probably this idea of student agency. Having this kind of compass and the navigation tools to make your own way through this increasingly volatile, ambiguous, and complicated world. And agency is not just about my own empowerment. It's also about co-agency. To what extent can I think for myself and work with others in life, in citizenship? So we have put that idea of student agency at the heart of this learning compass. Well, the compass is only as good as the map which you use for it. And actually that's about, the dimensions of learning. And people first think about knowledge, what people know. And yeah, I think knowledge is always the foundation for your success. But we need to rethink this as well. And we need to rethink how we measure it. Most of our measures are actually just looking at the surface of knowledge, because that's easy to test. It can give you a multiple choice question to see whether you have learned a specific fact or feature. Very easy to test, very cheap to do. But actually, it's very superficial. We see that from PISA actually. In some countries, actually, the United States or United Kingdom are good examples. Students are very good at that first layer of solving problems. But the moment you ask them to transfer their knowledge to a novel context, to extrapolate from what they know, to think across the boundaries of subject disciplines, these students struggle. And that's exactly what the modern world rewards. The modern world rewards not just, do we remember something that have been, we have been told, because that's what the technology can do so much better, but whether we are able to use our knowledge creatively. In one way, our education systems have been very good to educate second-class robots. People are very good at repeating what we tell them. We need to think much harder in this world of artificial intelligence. What makes us first-class humans? And epistemic understanding, deep conceptual understanding, is at the heart of this when it comes to knowledge. Can you think like a scientist rather than just, remembering facts and figures? Can you design an experiment? Can you distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from those that are not? That's what matters. Can you think like a mathematician? We teach students how to calculate an exponential function, fine. But understanding the nature of an exponential function is something totally different. No? And that's not very human. As humans, we are born into linear spaces. Time is linear, one day is like the next. Space is linear. You walk a kilometer and another kilometer looks like the same. Exponential functions are very, very hard for us to grasp. But much of the world around us is working in exponentials. Think about this pandemic. If we had truly understood the nature of an exponential function, we would have probably sent, 10,000 doctors where the first outbreaks of the virus were rather than 100. That's sort of so hard to grasp. Can you think like an historian? History is not about, names and places. It's about understanding how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it has developed, advanced, and sometimes how it unravels when the context changes. These are the kind of paradigms, these ways of thinking, deep epistemic reasoning, understanding what matters to be successful today. Also, your capacity to think across, the boundaries of subject disciplines. Big innovation today happens, when we connect the dots, see relationships between things that are not easily to be seen. Now, easy to say, really, really hard to measure. But actually, I must say, we have put a lot of effort into this in our PISA assessment. I think we've become quite good at actually sort of capturing that kind of epistemic understanding. And we do see some education systems are very good at that. Others, are more on the kind of surface. So that's when I talk about knowledge, I don't think we should, say, well, knowledge is less important today than it was in the past. It's the kind of knowledge. If you master the roots of a discipline, the conceptual foundations of a discipline, you can construct the knowledge throughout your life. You can accumulate new knowledge. If you've only learned to walk on the surface and that surface changes, you'll be on your own. But, knowledge, again, is very important, but it's just the starting point. In fact, the world no longer rewards us just for what we know. Now, Google knows everything. The world rewards us for what we can do with what we know. That's the skill dimension. No? And when you think about skills, most of us think immediately to cognitive skills. Creativity, critical thinking, very important. But actually, when you look at the evolution of labor demand and skill demand in the real world, today it's about social and emotional skills, curiosity, courage, leadership. Those are dimensions, empathy, that are becoming incredibly important, and perhaps that distinguish us most from the artificial intelligence we've created in our computers. Again, easy to say, really, really hard to measure. And some people say it's so difficult to measure that don't even start with this. I don't believe that. I don't belong to that school. I think 200 years ago, we could have said the same thing about mathematics and science. It took us 200 years to actually develop good measures of those kinds of dimensions. And I think with a little bit of effort, actually, we can achieve quite, promising outcomes also in these fields of social and emotional skills. We've actually started to do that at the OECD, and we found some really interesting patterns. When you think about classroom climates as a teacher, you want a good classroom climate, and many approach this through disciplinary policy. Yeah, that can be a very important tool. But look at this. Classroom climate was very strongly related to the sense of cooperation that students feel, to their creativity, to their self-efficacy, curiosity, emotional control, empathy, optimism. Many dimensions of social emotional skills were actually very good predictors for the classroom, for the climate, learning climate in a classroom. So as a teacher, yeah, you can impose discipline, or you can actually strengthen those kinds of social emotional skills. Well, the measures are probably not as good yet as they are in math and science, but actually I think they become credible. Give you another example, bullying. I mentioned already, a big detractor on student well-being. Well, actually, you can again counter that with, very strict kind of school policies and practices. But look at this, cooperation, emotional control, stress resistance, responsibility. Those things actually were quite important predictors for the intensity of bullying at school. And of course, you want your students to better focus, to be less distracted in class and so on. And once again, you can see actually also that seems to be quite well correlated with a range of social emotional skills. But again, we don't feature them in most of our assessments because, they're not as easy to capture. One of the things we ask ourselves as well, are our measures really good about this? And, one of the things that we did is then we, tested the students, we gave students this kind of assessment, and then we asked the parents and we asked the teachers. And actually, we found that the relationship worked out in quite similar ways. Isn't that interesting? So yeah, you can raise questions about the reliability of individual measures, but they seem to be pretty robust and consistent across different perspectives. And that, suggests to me that we're on a good path. We are on a good path to do some of these things better. One point that is really important to me is that we spend in education very little time on what we should teach at what stage of the lives of people. Often, when you think about early childhood education and care, that gets a lot of attention these days, but, mainly for two reasons. One is simply, parents need, time to work. But the other reason is that we want to give them an academic head start. So we push schooling down into the earlier years. That's happening in many countries. But look at this chart. Actually, these are the years where the social emotional development is absolutely critical. When you look at emotional control, being able to sort of manage yourself, manage your emotions, deal with uncertainty, navigate ambiguity, all of those things that are so important in this today's world, at age 1 and 2, they're actually skills, like reading and mathematics. When you grow older, at our ages, it's actually much more like a personality trait. It's very, very hard to change those things. So once again, better understanding of what humans learn best at what age is so crucially important. And then focus on this. And how do we know? Only by measuring those kinds of skills. Otherwise, all our public policies are driven by ideologies. Some people say, well, you should teach 2-year-olds mathematics. Then they're going to be better in mathematics at age 5 or 7. Actually, it's not borne out by data. Now that we are having those kinds of data, we can see quite different relationships. In the country where I live, in France, they're teaching children very early on quite formal kind of school skills. At age 15, France just does so-so on the PISA assessment. In Estonia, children go to school with 7 or sometimes 6, and before all of what they do is around, the development of the precognitive skills, social emotional skills. And actually, number 1 in PISA. So I think we need to better understand those relationships, treasure them, measure them in order to advance our understanding. It's really good. Now, if you would ask me, what are the most transformative competencies in the times in which we live? This is my list, 3 areas. One, I think, is pretty intuitive, our capacity to imagine, to build something of intrinsic positive force. That's probably our biggest differentiator from technology. Now, technology is great from extrapolating from what we know, but actually to look around the next corner, to imagine, to build new paradigms is still a very human kind of capability. Our capacity to reconcile tensions and dilemmas. The world is no longer black and white. Our capacity to navigate ambiguity. And then, to mobilize our cognitive, social, and emotional resources to take responsibility. When you think about, what does it mean for pedagogy? Well, I put, openness, anticipation first. We are very good in school to teach young people the established wisdom of our times. And most of the tests that we give them is about that. Does, my child know what I know? No, that's basically our current paradigm of assessment. Well, we do too little to, educate young people to question the established wisdom of our times. Learning is very important. I agree with this. But equally important today is our capacity to unlearn and to relearn when the context changes. To reflect, to step back, to see the bigger picture, to see the forest among the trees. So important in a world where we are inundated with impressions. And then again, mobilizing ourselves to take action. We know a lot of things. We can do a lot of things. But it doesn't mean that we're actually becoming active. So very, very important implications. Now, let me conclude with a few kind of trade-offs that are really, really hard to deal with when it comes to measurement. It's always about balancing validity and efficiency gains. Unfortunately, most of our measures sacrifice validity gains for efficiency gains. No? We basically end up to test a lot of people many times, and then we want to do that cheaply, and then we lose sight of what is really important, what we really treasure. No? We often sacrifice relevance for reliability. I know a number of ministers who lost their job because people have questioned some kind of national exam. Because there was a little bit of, problems in the reliability of the scoring of any of those kinds of things. That becomes very, very contested, controversial. Parents feel, my child has not been fairly assessed. So we put a lot of emphasis on making those assessments very robust, very reliable, kind of fireproof. Well, actually, often we lose relevance in this process. That's the origin of multiple choice questions, those kinds of simplistic ways of testing knowledge that actually lose sight of the more complex question. And we have felt that, I must say, in our work at the OECD, very much the same. I insisted that some of our questions need to remain complex, but the price for this has been, they required multiple raters, scores, and so on. It was really difficult. But, this is a very important trade-off. Again, the balancing of individual and social competence. Much of our assessment currently is framed, and actually many of our definitions of educational success are around individual competencies. Can you solve problems? But actually, collaborative problem solving could be as important, even more important in the world in which we live. Why is, your telephone so powerful? Because it's really well connected with the whole world. This is what technology does so extremely well. Computers become extremely powerful because they are networked. as humans, we have a lot of difficulties with it. A lot of difficulty of this comes down to the way we educate and learn, and then assess people. When we did our first assessment of collaborative problem solving skills, there was a lot of skepticism, even among students. We gave students those kind of tasks, and they took them a long time to understand they couldn't solve them on their own, because that's what they'd always done in the school test, that they needed other people to share their knowledge. Fourth point, in our assessments at the moment, we still very much value the correctness of the answer. And I can understand that, the students get the answer right. But actually, probably in the future, we're going to learn more from the process data. How did students tackle a question? Actually, learning analytics. I think the world of learning and the world of testing will one day be completely integrated. While we learn, we're actually assessing ourselves, and we learn more from the process than just from the outcomes. Again, it's a matter of balance, and we need to do this right. And then last but not least, we want to be, neutral as an observer, so we standardize our assessment conditions that makes them often very sterile. The future is a lot more about, authentic learning and testing conditions, particularly when we start to assess, practical and social emotional skills. They're very hard to assess in a kind of contrived artificial context. They are best assessed in authentic situations that contaminate, of course, the assessment situation, but at the same time strengthen relevance. None of these trade-offs is easy to deal with. I'm not saying this, but I think we need to think harder. And I do think today, with technology, we have the tools to do that well. Thank you very much.
Andreas, thank you for all of that. You mentioned something about the challenges of living in linear time earlier on in your presentation. That must be an enormous challenge for you at the moment, because everyone wants you to be presenting at their conferences. Emiliana, there's so much for you to respond to there. I was really struck by what I know of the work that you and Atentamente have done around agency in the Mexican context, and the emphasis that Andreas placed on agency as a factor in determining academic outcomes and happiness and sense of belonging. But over to you for your response, and then we'll see where the conversation goes after that.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you, Andreas, for this brilliant, clear, and very inspiring presentation. I come from the civil society, from an organization that we have been focusing on working on social emotional learning. As Dominic said, agency has been a major topic for us. But I want to say that the work that you have done and the OECD, first, helping us to think about why do we educate? What is the purpose of education? And saying well-being is something that we want to achieve for us, for others, for the whole society, has been a game changer for us when we think about social emotional learning and how to implement it in Mexico. Because this is something that really resonates with teachers. When we ask teachers, what do they want for themselves? What do they want for children, their students, and the children in the world in general? They always talk about well-being. And when we see that this is something that it's coming also from an organization like the OECD, then it takes another level of importance. And this is really important to mention, because our education has been focusing on knowledge, as you have mentioned, literacy and mathematics, and we are not getting the results that we're expecting. For example, we all want to be well, but in Mexico, we have huge problems of violence. And now this is increasing with the crisis of COVID. For example, we have a 120% increase in domestic violence. We have also problems with mental health disorders. We have big problems with inequality that are amplified by also this crisis. And of course, poor academic performance. So when we ask, we want to be well, but we have these challenges, what is lacking? Then there's where social emotional learning comes. And all your presentation, you gave us a lot of points on why is this important and why social emotional learning is a great predictor of success and well-being. And you mentioned particularly growth mindset, which I think it's very important concept. And in Mexico, what we found is that we really have a problem of fixed mindset in teachers, in which we believe that intelligence is something that has a characteristic that you have as a person, And there's this like cultural sayings, for example, that a tree that grows up twigged, it stays in that way, it cannot be straight. And neuroscience has brought also a lot of light on how we can actually change. And for us as a group that is promoting social and emotional learning, all the facts that we learn from neuroscience has helped us to explain why we can actually change, that our brain is plastic, and also has helped us to promote social emotional learning in particular ages, as you mentioned, early childhood. Something now in the Mexican law is that we have to focus, and that we have to make sure that children from 0 to 3 also get a quality of education. And we're focusing also on promoting social and emotional learning in those particular ages. You also mentioned school climate. And why is this big predictors of a school climate is of course social emotional learning skills in students. But what came to my mind also was important to focus on social emotional learning skills from teachers, because they are leaders in the classroom, and they are leaders in the school. And this is something that we're also trying to promote in the theories of change that we work as a civil society, but also in collaboration with the authorities, to really make sure that teachers are getting the materials and the teachers training to build up these competencies. And finally, you also mentioned about these transformative competencies for you, and one as this responsible decision making. And I made the connection about this with ethics and an ethical framework to work with. You didn't mention that, but maybe you can talk a little bit about that in a minute. And in Mexico, we're also bringing together an ethical framework that guides the social and emotional learning skills. So social and emotional learning skills are tools that help us, of course, to promote well-being, but also to promote some values like honesty, like justice, like solidarity, and so on. And so I think that the work that you are mentioning is crucial. And the fact that is based on research also help us to promote it. And we're doing our best in Mexico in association also with universities and other authorities. And we still have a lot of questions. I think Dominic has some of those questions for you. Thank you very much.
Emiliana, thank you so much for that. Andreas, is there anything you'd like to come back to Emiliana with before we move into some more
first of all,
questions?
it's just fantastic to see, it's easy to think about the theories of this, but to see them actually working on the ground. I think you do amazing work in Mexico to actually live those kinds of ideas. Two thoughts. I think the point on values that you made is really, really important. That's often something that we push aside from the education system, because that's where things get controversial, where things get contested. But I do think we need to, put the values not, on the periphery of what we teach and how we teach, but they need to become the core. In a way, I think even social and emotional skills are expressions of values. And I think we need to be conscious about the values. And I believe that people do not, grow up with a firm floor under their feet, and this is about values. Those are the people who are going to build walls. It's very difficult. I think it's a very difficult territory, but I think it's very important. The other point that you made that also struck me is really about ethics. In a way, in the past, if you were an engineer and you were unethical, you couldn't do a lot of damage. Today you can, actually. Artificial intelligence is not a power that makes good or bad decisions. It's just a great amplifier, a great accelerator. It amplifies good ideas and good practice in the same way it amplifies bad ideas and bad practice. And that again makes the human capacity of judging right and wrong so critically important. And it's again something, if we put that to the margins, it's nice to have, we will lose out on one of the most human capabilities that in this time is becoming increasingly important. And I think, again, it's great to see this working in a context that you work in.
social and emotional learning in lots of ways gets at the very heart of what it means to be human at this moment in time, because social and emotional skills and competencies are still the skills and competencies that can't be outsourced to algorithms or AI. They still help shape values. And throughout the presentation, you had some really compelling data about the efficacy and reasons for embedding and embracing SEL. Why do you think we're still having this conversation, Andreas, and why are some systems still pitching a kind of false dichotomy between SEL and knowledge, and why isn't SEL the norm?
I think there are bad reasons for this and better reasons for this. Let me start with the better reasons for this. Like, I do think some people are afraid that we apply the same measurement paradigms to social emotional skills that we use in cognitive tests. And that can be very damaging. For example, in a cognitive test, you can say, more mathematics is always better. Now, this is a kind of construct that grows. That's not so clear when you talk about social emotional skills. Think about persistence. You want, young people to grow up with agency, with persistence, with effort, but you don't want them to become stubborn. So actually it becomes a balance that always relates to the context. Social emotional skills are not about, creating a kind of fixed grid that we then impose on every student, as we do in math and science and literacy. They are a multidimensional space where actually, different combinations of social emotional skills may have relevance in different situations. So I think we need to develop a new measurement paradigm. And there are some people who are afraid we're just using, the kind of same principles that we use in reading and math, impose them on social emotional skills and then create a mess, or create stereotypes, or, increase kind of discrimination, all of those kinds of things. So I think that is a reason that with which I have some sympathy. I actually think that it is being dealt with today in our work at the OECD, for example. But I can understand this risk. The other reasons are simply, laziness. Sometimes it comes from those people who you do the measurement. It's just harder to do. There is a little bit more ambiguity introduced through the measures, which then, takes more trouble in explaining them. I think I must also say there's sometimes laziness by educators. It's actually quite interesting. We got some pushback even from, teachers who say, hey, in the past you assessed me for what I do, and now you want to assess me for who I am, because, social emotional skills are often not what is taught, but what is caught. They are coming from the learning context. And so you get that kind of pushback. But I think those kind of issues, I think it should start with, much more careful reflection on how are we going to deploy and use and interpret those measures. And then, how do we design environments in which we develop this? In a sense, I think there are many reasons why we are where we are. And one is simply also, there's a whole testing industry out there who makes a lot of money with, selling very simple kind of assessments. And there's no genuine incentive to actually drive this agenda forward. I can give you an example, even from the PISA world. When we test mathematics, the whole world participates, we assess social skills. We are lucky when half of the countries take part in this work. So many people think, well, that's not what parents and people care about. So I don't accept those kinds of reasons. Whereas there are some issues that really need to be dealt with better.
With the sort of engaging educators to embrace this kind of reform, Emiliana, in Mexico, Construyete did some really interesting work with teacher unions, didn't it, at the very beginning of developing it as a national movement. And maybe you could say a little bit about that, if that was okay.
Yes, sure. In Mexico, there was a lot of interest from teachers to get social emotional learning. And then one of the challenges was that it was introduced as a part of an educational reform coming from the top bottom. And then as it was an imposition, there was a work that we had to do in order to sensibilize teachers that this is actually useful for them. And in the work that we did with Construyete is a program on social emotional learning skills that it's designed for high schools. So when we changed the strategy, something very important was to bring up the teachers and the leaders, like the directors, for example, principals, to learn how important were these competencies, and that they could actually embody them, which is another, the other topic. No, this is, we know that it's important, we can talk about it, but how do you actually embody these skills is a whole another challenge.
So we're, as everyone on the call, and both of you are very well aware, we're in the midst of this moment of kind of great and profound change, where there's simultaneously both the global crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has got the potential to change education systems radically for the better, hopefully. And then there are also all of the protests against racial injustice and discrimination that have been inspired in many countries around the world by the Black Lives Matters movement in the US. So we'd posted some questions on the Knowledge Hook site that we'd be really interested in getting both of your reflections on that relate to those two, those two major factors in why this is such a moment of change. So Andreas, are you seeing ways in which COVID-19 is changing thinking about the fundamental purpose of education and specifically where and how learning can take place?
Oh yeah, and there are some very obvious ways. For example, you know, students who have built agency, who have learned how to learn, developed a great set of learning strategies, who have, you know, curiosity, the motivation, they enjoy learning, who have, you know, live in an ecosystem of support. For them, this COVID experience has been liberating and exciting, you know, not to sit all day still in a school class and to do things on your own. I think that's really interesting. But at the same time, you know, students who used to be spoon-fed by their teachers, who learn in little chunks and pieces, who never enjoyed school in the first place, who just, for them, they have been left very badly behind in this Corona crisis. I think what this moment shows is that actually social emotional skills are real. Actually, they are huge determinators for, you know, our engagement in society, for our living, for our well-being. I think that's something that's come across, you know, in May, together with Harvard University, we did a survey. And what was really quite striking is that, you know, in the past, academic learning always ranked by a, you know, large margin first. Now, actually, academic learning, student well-being, teacher well-being, were almost, you know, got the same kind of appreciation from stakeholders. I think that's something the crisis has brought really, really home. The moment, I think what people take away from the crisis is two things. Students, for example. The first is, you know, learning is not a place, but an activity. It's not, you know, learning is really about, you know, the way, it's not a transactional process, it's a relational process. The second thing I think students take away from this, you know, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what they will remember is the teacher who took care of them, you know, the teacher who understood who they are, who understood their dreams, who supported them in their learning process. That's going to be the need from this crisis. And I think, again, this is a lot to do with this agenda here.
And do you get the sense that senior education leaders or ministers are recognizing the value of social and emotional learning specifically at this moment, and that creates a greater window for SEL reform than we've perhaps seen before?
Yeah, you know, the survey that I mentioned actually was administered to officials. So actually that reflects the views of administrators, policymakers. You know, you never know how, you know, the status quo in education has many protectors. And I must say, actually, sometimes we as parents are part of that. You know, we get very anxious when our children no longer learn things that were very important for us. And even more so when they do learn things that, you know, we no longer understand. So I think there is pushback from society actually to change things in education. But I'm pretty confident that, you know, after this crisis, you're going to see not a few, but a lot of students who will go to their teachers and say, well, hey, I learned really in so interesting ways. I discovered new things. Can we do that in our lesson? And I think you're going to see a lot of teachers who go to their school leaders and say, well, actually, you know, I became in this crisis, I wasn't just a good instructor, I became a good coach, I became a good mentor, a good facilitator, a great evaluator. So can we do more of this in tomorrow's schooling? So I think actually the scale of the crisis, it means that innovation, new ideas now also reach a different scale. So yeah, I'm quite, you know, optimistic that this agenda around social emotional learning will gain traction.
I can say for the case of Mexico that this crisis also brought more awareness on social emotional learning. Before, we were talking more about ethics and civics engagement, but now with this crisis, we see the mental health crisis like rising. And there's a book that's going to be published by the Ministry of Education. And one of the chapters is about the importance of social and emotional learning for this moment, but also like to prevent future crises. And the challenge that we have is that we don't have now like a lot of training, a lot of materials. We have materials on how to confront the health crisis, but not the mental health one.
You see a correlation between the countries that have historically done well in PISA and the kinds of effective response to supporting learning or managing education during the COVID-19 crisis?
Absolutely. I think, you know, what you do see is that high-performing education system, perhaps the most important differentiator is a lot of capacity at the front line. You know, sometimes their teachers teach less, but they actually work more. They spend a lot more time with students outside the classroom setting. They are much more engaged in the lives of students. They have close relationships with the families. And this is, in a moment of crisis, paying really, really off, where teachers are just, you know, work in a kind of factory setting. They just, you know, teach one lesson after the other. This crisis has made life very hard, you know, for you as a teacher, because you can't do that anymore. Where teachers work in an environment where they're actually designers of innovative learning environments, where they work with their colleagues, where there is, you know, investment in their own kind of learning, where they have sufficient time and experience. I think high-performing education systems, teachers do not just know their subjects really well. They also deeply understand how different students learn that subject differently. And most importantly, they do know their students. And I think that is something that in this moment of crisis has paid off very, very well. And you can see that really well, that high-performing education systems, many of them got through this crisis very quickly because they could rely on the people at the front line.
There's, I think it's RAND, the US think tank, have got some really interesting survey data that has found that schools that had a strong culture of teacher cooperation pre-COVID-19 have been particularly effective at supporting learning during, and you sort of start to think about insights like that, and the survey that you referenced with was it with Fernando Rimas from Harvard, looking at kind of what we can learn from the last 3 months that can help with preparedness for a second wave or for other analogous crises. And are there other examples beyond that sort of teacher cooperation one that you're seeing?
Yeah. You know, for me, sort of teacher professional autonomy and the collaborative culture are two sides of the same coin. Yeah. You know, teacher professional autonomy is not about, you know, I do what I like to do today. You know, it's about I do what I know is right in the name of my profession, because, you know, I work every day with my colleagues and we study things together. We own our professional standards. And I think in a crisis like this is what helps you. You know, in a moment like this, even the best education minister cannot solve the problems of, you know, 10,000s of schools and millions of students. But if we can, you know, find the best ideas in classrooms and schools and scale and spread them, and this is about, you know, a collaborative culture, you can design education. I think the faster education systems advance and move, and societies, you know, advance, the less and less works this kind of top-down hierarchical kind of system. So I think those aspects are very, very important. But, you know, professional autonomy, a collaborative culture also come from a work organization and work environment that is, you know, giving people perspectives. We have, in many countries, actually, Mexico is a good example. Actually, teaching is financially quite attractive in relative terms, but it's intellectually not attractive. And I think that is basically, you know, still not engaging those kinds of people that you really want to be teachers now.
The skills that underpin those behaviors, like collaboration, are obviously core SEL skills. We're unfortunately very close to time, so I wondered if I could ask each of you for a final comment, and maybe you could frame it around your top recommendation for people who are looking to implement better preparedness to help support learning during, you know, the next phase of COVID-19. So from everything that you've seen during the last 3 months, particularly how it relates to social and emotional learning, and the fact that SEL is gaining traction, what would be your #1 recommendation for institution or system leaders? Emiliana, could I come to you first, and then Andreas will give you the last word.
I think that to remember our compass, so to remember what is the purpose of education and have the priorities, that they may change context by context, but like thinking what is the purpose of education, that would be the first thing. And then the second one, also to give the tools. This is a moment also of a financial crisis, but if we don't give the proper training, the proper tools to make sure that teachers and families and of course children have everything that they need to go ahead, then this is going to be very difficult. And also to have coverage, for example, if we are going to use technology to reach the people in education, we need to also focus on that. I think that would be my recommendation.
Thank you.
Yeah, you know,
Andreas.
my answer is actually very similar. I do think the advent of artificial intelligence pushes us to think much harder of what it means to be human. And I do think that is the conversation in which educators should engage. We have a tradition in education that we think, oh, well, you know, someone in the government or some academic figure out the curriculum, and then, you know, our role as educators is to put that into practice. I think we need to develop much more ownership, not just for the how question, but also for the what question that Emiliana called the purpose of education. And I think, you know, when teachers ask themselves, you know, that question, they will very quickly get to the social and emotional agenda. And for most teachers, actually, when we surveyed them in Thales, what was really interesting is that, why did you become a teacher? Actually, it had actually relatively little to do with kind of work organization salaries. Most of it was about, I want to make it to people and to the lives of our society. And again, that is what we should empower people also to deal with the what question. And how, you know, your question was, of course, more specifically what can be done at policymakers level. I think, you know, we should just engage to teach fewer things in greater depth. You know, slim down our requirements of schools to create more space and more responsibility for good decisions at the front line. I think we can achieve a lot with this. And then, you know, build a collaborative culture, create, you know, networks. Policymakers can create very powerful networks and also incentives for people to actually share their experience and collaborate effectively. And as a policymaker these days, you know, don't ask yourself, you know, how many people follow your ideas. Ask yourself how well your people can collaborate. That's going to be the key to the effectiveness of systems.
Emiliana, there's so much to engage with there. So maybe before we get into a Q&A, it would be great to hear some reflections from you about what Andreas was talking about and how it plays out in Mexico. Mexico is such an interesting country when we think about SEL, because Mexico has gone further and faster than any comparable education system in terms of embedding and implementing SEL. And you've been absolutely integral to the design of the different frameworks and a lot of the success that has come with that program. So it would be lovely to hear your thoughts before we move into a discussion.
Thank you very much, Dominic. And we just had an amazing, clear and inspiring presentation from Andreas on why is it important to implement social and emotional learning. We started working on this topic in 2011. And when we approached teachers, they could see how this was important because we asked them, what do you want for yourself and what do you want for children? And all of them basically answered, we all want to be well. We want well-being, which is the purpose of education. Also, this is what the OECD is stating in this white paper on education for the 2030. But we didn't have so much data as we have now. So all this work of evaluating social and emotional learning skills really was a change maker in Mexico. So we were able also to talk with policymakers on why this is so important and why is it so important to get it into the national curriculum. In 2016, we were able to introduce social emotional learning, as I mentioned, as part of the national curriculum. So from pre-K to high school, children and youth have a particular space to work on self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy, collaboration, decision-making, and perseverance. And there's something that I want to talk about is about this topic of growth mindset, because Andreas told us that growth mindset is really an amazing predictor of success. And what we found at the beginning is that teachers in Mexico didn't have that much of that growth mindset. Many people believe in Mexico, and still this is something that is going on now, that that intelligence is something that is kind of part of your personality. It's very common to label children as that you're the intelligent one, you're the smart one, you're not so much good at mathematics, for example. And we have been working a lot, thanks to also bringing neuroscience into our social emotional learning curriculum, because now we know that the brain is very plastic. It's called neuroplasticity, and that with effort, you can really build up your competences. You can even if you're an adult, not only for children, but also for adults. So to change, to help teachers to change from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset was very important for us in Mexico. And then neuroscience also has helped us to focus on some particular ages to work with social and emotional learning. In particular, as a civil association, we have been working a lot with early childhood and also with adolescence, because we know that these are particular important ages of brain development. And if we can focus on those ages on, for example, self-regulation of emotions and decision-making, it's really crucial. And now in Mexico, the law has changed, and now early childhood education, it's mandatory. And we have also collaborated on the curriculum to emphasize the importance of social emotional learning, but also to develop a guide for parents. So parents in the early childhood education are being able also to work on these topics. And finally, Andreas also mentioned the importance of school climate and how it is related to social and emotional learning skills. And when he was talking about that, I was thinking on the importance of teachers developing these competencies, because they can change, they are the leaders in the classroom and can really foster this collaboration. And also they can change the school climate in the way that they work with the director, with the principals, with the parents, etc. So the role of the teachers has been very important for us, and it's a challenge that we still have to give them the tools to develop all these competencies. And finally, Andreas was also talking about these transformative skills of taking responsibility, of creativity, and also of dealing with the dilemmas. And I think that this is very related with the relationship between social and emotional learning and ethics, that this is a new work that we are implementing in Mexico. So with the Ministry of Education, we are writing a book for parents on ethics and social and emotional learning, that it's gonna come up in August. And I hope that it will help to also work on these different skills.
I think with everything that you've just said, and then all of the data and the evidence that was in Andreas's presentation, it's astonishing in many ways why we're still having a conversation about whether social and emotional learning ought to be an integral part of education. It feels like there's an astonishing body of compelling evidence that shows how essential it is pre-pandemic, let alone in the current moment where it's even more important than it's ever been before. So I'm interested to get your thoughts on why this conversation is still playing out, and why it isn't now accepted universally that education systems ought to be teaching and developing SEL.
I see two main issues, and we see it even in Mexico, where this was implemented in the national curriculum. The first one is that it's still not many people know or understands what is social and emotional learning. And for example, they like, well, I cope well with my emotions, and social emotional learning maybe is just about hugging and saying good morning and good evening. So this is some beliefs that we still have and that we have to challenge in order to understand what is social and emotional learning skills, why, and how do you actually develop these skills. And the second one, I think, that is related with the lack of measurements. As Andreas mentioned, it's hard to measure. And since we don't know how to measure the development, and yeah, I mean, we have a gap there. We have been trying in Mexico, for example, to build frameworks and to evaluate it, but it's still the ways of evaluating is just a standardized testing, that it's not very profound. I think that if we could help the people to understand what is social and emotional learning and how you can measure it, it will be easier.
So to stick with your two fundamental barriers, I suppose, so there's issues around advocacy or global, public understanding of the topic, and then there's specific challenges around measurement. So when Construite and the SEL programs in Mexico were being developed, almost a decade ago now, how did you tackle the advocacy piece? And did you find that it was most important to get parents on board, or did you start with persuading the education community and teachers and the teachers unions, or did it start with leadership in the ministry?
Yeah, we actually started working directly with teachers, but we found out that if we didn't have the support of the authorities, and if it was not coming from the policy, it was going to be very, very difficult to go forward. So we had the fortune that in 2015, 2016, there were authorities that were thinking of making this educational reform and listening about other and what's going on with other countries, and also looking at the reports, for example, from the OECD and other international agencies. They were interested on this topic. And that's where they came with us because we had some experience already implementing. So I think that this was a key to be able to have the authorities interested on this topic, like seriously, and they being open to learn that there was experience already on the field. And then when this happened, everything changed literally, because before we will need to go to the schools and then talk to the teachers, and almost it was basically the private schools that were taking like some placing attention on this topic. But then when it became a part of policy, then all the public education started to talk about social and emotional learning. So bring the authorities on board, I think, is really, really crucial. And now we're trying to make this systemic change. So now it's when we are bringing now the parents into the conversation. It took us like some years because, for example, from the Ministry of Education, there are not very clear channels to get directly to the parents. So we are kind of able to do it as a civil association, but now also the Ministry of Education is finding those paths to get to the parents. In early childhood is easier because there's a natural relationship between the professional, like the caretakers, but for other levels, it's a new path that it's opening.
I think the point about that then the other countries that you could look to, who were in some ways modeling the kinds of reform behavior that you were interested in, is really important, and having more national systems or regional provincial systems that are embracing SEL is really important. And one of the things that we find both with the work with Karanga and also the work in Salzburg Global Seminar around SEL is that the number of examples of countries and systems is growing slowly, and it does feel very much like SEL is an idea whose time is coming. Jennifer, I wonder if I could bring you into the conversation, because you worked really closely with Andreas on the OECD study on SEL. And there are 10 countries, I think you told me before, who are part of the study, and the report's coming out next year. Could you share a bit more about that and which 10 countries it is? You don't have to remember all 10 of them to put you on the spot.
Thanks, Dominic. And as you and Emiliana were talking, I just couldn't help reflecting. We began work on that OECD study almost 10 years ago. And at the time, I have to admit, it was tough slugging. It was really hard to have countries want to come and think about an evaluation, an international evaluation or assessment that would be solely on social emotional skills. How would we teach them? How would we evaluate them? Are these the skills that are important? And the time has come. 10 years later, I agree 100% with your comment. When we're working with global leaders, when we're talking with policymakers in ministries of education from countries around the world, developing countries, countries from the West, all of those policymakers are trying to get at that concept of how do we bring social emotional learning in. The study itself, it was invitational. It began with the concept of a city in a country, and we wanted to keep it relatively small because it was the first time out. Andreas kept reminding us, remember when PISA started, there were 5 countries that were involved in the first administration of PISA. So we determined that we would come up with about 10. And we had 10 countries that ended up participating. Ottawa participated for Canada, Houston for the USA. We had Portugal, we had Italy, we had Finland, we had China, we had South Korea, and I'm missing a Colombia from South America. We didn't have anyone from Africa, and we didn't have anyone from Australia, New Zealand. But in addition to those 10 countries, we had lots of countries that would attend the design meetings to learn more about it. And as I kept saying to Andreas, this is exactly where we want to be, because it's not about creating a study so at the end you do something. It's about doing something with education systems while you're learning about that topic so that you don't wait to the end, you're actually starting to move those systems. And I'll tell you one quick anecdote. We would have, 20 or 25 different country representatives sitting around a table. And at one point, when we would start our meeting, we'd say, well, why are you here? And I had Costa Rica sitting beside South Korea. And Costa Rica said, South Korea started and said, we're very interested in social emotional learning skills. We know that our children perform very well on PISA assessments, but they have huge challenges with well-being and suicide rates, etc. And so that's why we're here. And Costa Rica came back and said, actually, we do really poorly on PISA skills, but we know our children are really happy and they're doing well. So it was just a wonderful comment, and we all come from different contexts, but I think there is a real global movement to say we need a broad set of skills that include not only academic skills and technical skills, but social emotional learning skills as well.
But that was a really good moment in amongst many great moments in Andreas's presentation, where he was talking about social emotional learning and deeper epistemic reasoning. And he looked at the kind of connection between SEL and history. Well, how do you be a historian with social and emotional learning, or SEL and science, or SEL and maths? And I was sort of interested, Emiliana, to come back to Mexico and just the kind of the practical examples of how Mexico embedded SEL in the curriculum, and was it embedded in specific subjects, or did it become a standalone subject, or was it a mix of both?
Yeah, in 2016, when the reform was, it was an explicit subject called social and emotional learning. And so we designed the standards for each year, and children will have a space in the week. It was at the beginning just 30 minutes because, as Andrea was mentioning, one of the big problems and challenges and things that always people said is, we don't have time to introduce another thing like social emotional learning because we need to cover our curriculum. But we found the space, like 30 minutes at least, and this was for basic education. And so the idea is that you have a specific time to work with these skills, but also you apply them in various moments during the day. For example, if there's a conflict, what a good moment to practice empathy, right? If you're going to start the exam, then maybe you can practice self-regulation technique to calm down and let out the anxiety. Yeah. So that was the idea in basic education. But for high school was somewhat different. And for high school, we had the program Construyete. And the challenge here is that in high school, you have many different teachers. You have the math teacher, the literacy teacher, the ethics, the biology. And so the program of Construyete designed activities, but also try to link it with the different, with some of the subjects. So for example, if you're a math teacher, you will have the program Construyete, so you can give 20-minute session of social and emotional learning, but it's gonna be a little bit linked with the problems that you're having in math. So for example, with academic anxiety, or with some topic that is related to your class. So in this way, we try to make the link, but also to work very explicitly on the skills. And this is maybe a question for the both of you, of what have you seen in different countries. For us, we really believe that you have to teach it explicitly and also transversely.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Sorry, Emiliana, I was just going to jump in and say exactly. I mean, that's what we're seeing around the world. We're seeing a combination, kind of one of two approaches. Either people are taking it and doing a very explicit part and having it as a certain part of the day, but then moving towards that integration across different curricula areas. And some other systems are moving, are starting right at the integration point. And I think depending on your education system and depending on your context, either one of those work really well. And I'd just like to give a little bit of a shout out. I know I have some people from Ontario on right now, and they might be willing to share a link. The Ontario Ministry of Education put out a brand new curriculum for mathematics. They released it last week, and it will be implemented. We're beginning implementation in September. And I was so excited. I opened up the curriculum, and the very first page is social emotional learning in mathematics. That's the first page of the curriculum for each of the grade levels, grades 1 to grade 8. And they have a wonderful chart there that talks about what are the social emotional skills that we're trying to teach? How does that make sense in math processes? Or how do we see that happening in math processes? And what are the outcomes for students if we teach this way and we assess mathematics this way? So we're starting to see examples of what that can look like. And this is what Karanga is about. This is what the Knowledge Hook Signature Leadership Series is about. It's creating networks and opportunities for people to share these kinds of things.
So we have about 10 minutes left for the discussion. I'd be really interested to kind of move the conversation a little bit forward and think about the current moment and the way in which the COVID-19 pandemic is disrupting education systems around the world, and what this means for social and emotional learning, and what opportunities it creates potentially. And this is one of the most obvious questions, is that at the moment, parents in many school systems are much more involved in the education of their children than they are in normal times. And I wondered, Emiliana, if in Mexico there are examples of resources being produced to help parents understand the social and emotional learning needs of their children, and thinking about how you can use the school shutdown time to help children develop that.
Yes, definitely. Something that we found is that with this crisis, we are living a mental health crisis. We already have a lot of problems, for example, with anxiety and depression. There's 300 million people in the world suffering from depression, and now this is amplified by this crisis. And we also know from research that social and emotional learning in schools can really help to mitigate the nocive effects of this crisis, and also to prevent and to build the resources to what's coming in the future. And at the beginning, really, the focus on education was on how do we keep children learning what they were already learning, and also how do we care about the physical health. But as the months passed, and also the needs of teachers and families were more available to policymakers and to everyone, we realized the importance of social and emotional learning again. And now the government gave 9 strategies for coming back to school. And then the 9th strategy is about giving social and emotional learning tools to children and to teachers. So we as a civil association, obviously very quickly try to put together, to transform our programs that were designed to be in person, to an online modality. So we also evaluate the programs to find ways to use technology in a way that still creates community among teachers and participants in general, because this is a really important protector for what is going on. And we had a very good results. We saw that the programs were as effective like in digital ways that they were in person. And we also developed some materials for self-care for teachers that we are very happy we partnered to Karanga to promote, and they're totally free. So now many teachers are getting these materials, which is something very simple that they can use on a daily basis to work with their emotions and also to build empathy and collaborations, which is something that Andreas was already also mentioning, of the importance of fostering collaboration, even if we have to be with the social distance, right? It doesn't matter. Yeah. So we created that material, and now this book that is going to be for parents on social emotional learning, but also attached to ethics. And this is very important because we have seen an increase on domestic violence. I think this is happening in the world, but it's really awful in Mexico. And so we are attaching these skills on this bigger framework of specific values.
That's amazing, and we'll find the link to put in the chat for the
Yes.
Identimente resource in a second, because I can see a number of people asking for it. It feels like in the last 4 or 5 months have been, some amazing accelerated learning about the kinds of qualities or the sorts of culture in institutions and at a system level that have been most able to adapt and support educators and students. There was a really interesting study that RAND have done in the US, where one of their conclusions is that schools that had a high culture of teacher collaboration pre-pandemic have been much more able to support learning and educators during the school shutdown period. And I think it sort of opens up a reform agenda or a set of reform questions about what kinds of culture do we most want to incubate when schools do return to something close to what they were like before, in order to help with both future preparedness, if there's a second wave or if there's an analogous situation to the pandemic, but also because these are the kind of values and ethics and qualities and behaviors that we hope teachers can embody, and we want young people to be able to develop during their time in education. So beyond the teacher, this is a really long question, sorry, beyond the teacher collaboration point, are there other examples from your work in Mexico that you think are really important for creating the right kind of culture for SEL to flourish?
Yeah, I think that to bring these resources in different channels, because, and also so that parents or all the ecosystem can understand why is it important and how can they implement it in their different communities. This is something very important. We have seen in Mexico. In Mexico, we already have like educational TV. So I think that these resources have to go also to those channels. It hasn't happened yet. But these resources should go to all the different channels, to the radio, and to even to WhatsApp. WhatsApp is the most used way of communication for teachers, because in Mexico we don't have like a lot of coverage of internet, for example. So they are communicating among themselves and with students and parents through WhatsApp. So if we can find ways to bring these tools through all these different media, that will be very, very important. And I think that leadership, and it's not only important to give these tools to teachers, but also to give them to principals, to supervisors, and to people in the ministry and all the different authorities here. We have seen also that when teachers are let alone with these kind of tools, particularly if they are digital, we don't have as a high rate of finishing like the workshops as we have them when the authorities are on board. So I don't know if that happens in other countries, I imagine it's the same, but if the leaders are communicating that this is important And moreover, not only communicating, but if they are able to embody and to lead with social and emotional skills, that really makes a significant change. What do you think? Have you seen this in other countries, in other examples?
There's an interesting parallel, isn't there, with the kind of strategies for both having SEL as a standalone subject and making sure it's embedded across different subjects, and then thinking about the strategies for driving reform across the whole education ecosystem. And it's both having the teachers as the classroom practitioners on board with it, but then also making sure that parents and leaders understand it as well. I think, you know, one of the other systems which I think has been enormously successful at embedding SEL is Delhi, with the happiness curriculum. And I think they took a similar approach to what you've described in Mexico, that there was a concerted policy to help parents understand where this reform was coming from and to help teachers change classroom practice. And Delhi's had astonishing success with it. And I think that program is now being replicated in seven other Indian states. So there are, I mean, as Jennifer was saying before, there are, you know, some really fantastic case studies of success around social and emotional learning, where the context in which it's flourishing is very, very different. And it does feel, you know, that this is an argument which is beginning to be won, perhaps, and that the opportunities, you know, in amongst the trauma and tragedy of the pandemic, the opportunities for thinking differently about the future of education, social and emotional learning is a critical part of that. Thank you so much for being with us and being part of this conversation. The insights that you shared are absolutely fantastic. And it was great to be able to reflect on Andreas's presentation with you. And thank you very much to everyone who's been listening and for all the comments and conversations that have gone on in the chat. Jennifer, back to you.
Thank you, Dominic. And on behalf of the participants today, I would just like to do a huge thank you to you and to Emiliana and to Andreas for the previous presentation. We've had a great discussion and there is so much to be talking about as we go into the future. I've got some great news to share. The three partners have agreed that we will continue offering the SEL Global Leadership Series into the 2020-2021 school year. So we will be sharing that out with you. We do have a place that if you're looking for some of these resources, you're welcome to go to knowledgehook.com/leadership. This on-demand version will be available, and as well as the slides from Andreas. But in addition to that, you can have access to the on-demand versions for all the previous roundtables, and we have podcasts up there now, and we have some great research and blogs on the topics of Education 2030, future skills, and improving math achievements. So join us there. And the final thing that I'll say just before closing off is that we will be coming back and continuing on with our roundtables. And our next one will be on August the 26th, and we promise to send out invitations. So thanks to all of you, the participants, and to Emiliana and Dominic and to Andreas, and we look forward to seeing you at the end of August. Thanks so much.